Hi, folks. We'll get started now. It's a fairly full evening, and I want to make sure you get to hear all of the discussions. If there are folks joining after, we'll be recording this, so you can always watch back on what you missed. It's a pleasure to welcome you all, both those of you joining from here in the US and those who might be watching back later. We're delighted that you've come and joined us for this series. My name is Kevin Byrne. I'm the Consul General here at the Irish Consulate in Chicago, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this second lecture in the Irish Embassy's A Farther Shore series, which is really a reflection on the advent of Irish independence. The series is hosted in partnership with ACES, the American Conference of Irish Studies, and the Irish consulates throughout the US. The embassy and consulates are really so lucky to have such strong centres of excellence in Irish studies right throughout the US, and during this series, we'll be partnering with many of those centres. The purpose of the series is very much to be a resource, an opportunity for education and reflection on really what is probably one of the most consequential periods in Irish history, and one that's really shaped modern Ireland and Ireland today. Whether you've participated in the first lecture with Boston College, or whether you're joining us for the first time today, I hope you'll join us for the rest of the series. As I said, this is being recorded, so you can watch back and dip in and cover any points that you missed or any points of particular interest. All of this will be hosted on the social media sites of the consulates and the embassy, so you can always watch back there. If this is the first one you've joined us for, you're joining for a great event. Today's lecture looks at reflections on the War of Independence. This evening's event is brought to you in partnership with DePaul University here in Chicago and the Centre for Irish Studies. I'll be handing over shortly to the moderator, Mary McCain, who's a great friend of the consulate, who will lead this event, and we'll take questions later on. Before I introduce the ambassador, just a few housekeeping notes. Questions, please ask questions. You can either pop them into the Q&A, or if you prefer, you can pop them into the chat function as well. We have members of the team will be looking for your questions there, and you'll have an opportunity to have those questions answered later on in the event. Also, out of interest, I suppose one of the benefits of doing events online is that folks can tune in from right across the States and maybe even further afield. So feel free to pop into the chat box, where you're dialing in from or where you're tuning in from. Always interesting to see where folks are coming from. Ambassador Mulhall will speak to you now about the series and share some of his reflections on the War of Independence. Ambassador Mulhall is really a man who needs no introduction, but for those of you that don't know, I'll just share a little bit about him. He took up as Ireland's 18th ambassador to the United States in summer of 2017. He's a proud Waterford man, an undergraduate and a postgraduate from the University College in Cork, where he specialised in modern Irish history. In his over 40-year career, he served in New Delhi, in Vienna, in Brussels, in the European Union, in Edinburgh, and as Ireland's ambassador to Malaysia and to Germany. Prior to joining us here in the US as ambassador in DC, he served as Ireland's ambassador to London from 2013 to 2017, a very consequential period in modern British history. He was also part of the Irish government's delegation at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and he maintains a keen interest in Irish history and literature. Indeed, he's the author of A New Day Dawning, A Portrait of Ireland in 1900, and a co-editor of The Shaping of Modern Ireland, A Century Assessment. Many of you will know him from his social media presence at Dan Mulhall and through his regular blogs that he posts on the website. Without further ado, I'll hand over to the ambassador. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in this evening. I want to start by saying something about the period of history which we're now commemorating. That is what we call the Decade of Centenaries, the centenaries of the events that occurred in Ireland between 1912 and 1922. And that was an extraordinary period in Irish history when Ireland was transformed from being a part of the United Kingdom in 1912, seeking home rule, a form of self-government, a more modest form of self-government. And in 1922, it became an independent country for the first time in 800 years. So a huge transformation. And I would say that was probably the most consequential and frenetic decade in Irish history. And that's why its centenary has been marked over the last decade with great care and attention on the part of the Irish government and the Irish academic community. Now, let's be clear. A lot of things happened during that decade. Let me just list some of the things that happened both in Ireland and internationally. In one 10-year period, we think our period is a busy one. You had the Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914, which brought Britain to the brink of civil war. Not just Ireland, but Britain to the brink of civil war, because there were differences of opinion in Britain about whether Ireland should be granted Home Rule or not. You had a world war, the First World War. You had the Easter Rising. You had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You had the emergence of Sinn Fein in Ireland after the Easter Rising as a formidable national movement. You had an election in 1918, which turned out to be the most important election in the whole of Irish history, I would say. Then you had the establishment of the first Dáil in 1919, the War of Independence, which we're looking at today between 1919 and 1921, the partition of Ireland into Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, the negotiations on the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921, the split in Ireland over the treaty between those who supported the treaty and those who rejected it, the establishment of the Irish Free State, which is the predecessor of the country that I've been proud to represent for the past 43 years as a member of the Irish Foreign Service. And then sadly, the decade finishes with the Irish Civil War, a terrible tragedy in Irish history, which of course we'll have to deal with in one of the subsequent sessions of A Farther Shore. So there's quite a lot to reflect on, which is why I decided a few months ago to do a series of events to explore the issues that arose during that war, during that period between 1919 and 1922. I call this A Farther Shore because my view is that Ireland reached a farther shore in 1921 when it became independent, when the treaty was signed between Britain and Ireland, paving the way for Irish independence in 1922. That farther shore could not have been imagined 10 years previously, when all that Irish people could possibly aspire to was home rule, as I said, a more modest form of self-government, certainly a long way short of independence, the kind of independence we enjoy today. So I'm very glad that we have the support of so many premier American universities that have Irish studies centers. And this evening we combine with DePaul University, and I want to thank the Director of Irish Studies there, Mary McCain. So this evening we turn our attention to the War of Independence. I'm delighted to have a distinguished panel that Mary will introduce later, from Mary McAuliffe from UCD, Timothy McMahon from Marquette University, and Professor Justin Dolan Stover from Idaho State University. So a very good panel of experts. So what can I say about the War of Independence? What I would say is that it's one of these events which generates a lot of debate and controversy in Ireland, because whereas the Easter Rising was a fairly straightforward affair of a heroic struggle against all the odds, which resulted in the execution of 15 of the leaders of the Rising, and then everything that happened in Ireland flowed from that. The War of Independence is a much more complex phenomenon, and there are lots of, ifs and buts about it, lots of debates about the legality, the morality, and so forth of the way in which the war was conducted. The background to it was that in 1918, at the general election, Sinn Fein, which before the Easter Rising had been a small fringe party, but had become a much more formidable political force after 1916, basically triumphed in that election. They got about 46% of the national vote, and they won 73 of the 100 Irish seats. The rest of the seats went either to the Irish Party, which previously had had 75 seats in the previous parliament elected in 1910. But by 1918, the Irish Party's representation had shrunk to 6. So it went down from 70 odd to 6. And the Sinn Féin Party went from 0 to 73. So a total, a colossal victory on the part of Sinn Fein. So the Sinn Fein party, those that were elected in 1918, didn't dither. They went for the jugular, as you might say in colloquial parlance. And within a month of the general election, they had established a parliament in Dublin, declared independence, made an appeal to the free nations of the earth to recognize Irish independence. And on that day, the War of Independence broke out. Now, that might make you assume that it was the first Dáil meeting in Dublin in 1919 that authorized the War of Independence. It wasn't quite like that, because the people who met in Dublin to form the first Dáil in January 1919 had no idea that on the same day there was going to be an ambush in County Tipperary that actually resulted in the what we now regard as the start of the War of Independence. So that war started with that ambush in County Tipperary on the 21st of January 1919, and it continued until the 11th of July 1921. So 2.5 years until a ceasefire was declared and negotiations began between the British government and the Sinn Féin government in Ireland. And those negotiations resulted in the establishment of the Irish Free State on the basis of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. So this is not a normal war. This is not a war in the normal sense of the word. Those who fought the war, the Irish volunteers, they were maybe 3,000 in number, or at least Michael Collins estimated that there were 3,000 people who were active in the Irish volunteers and were available to do things as part of the War of Independence, the so-called War of Independence. They were up against perhaps 50,000 British security forces. So there's no way they should have had a hope of winning that war. But in the end, they prevailed. An extraordinary achievement, in my view. Now, the War of Independence, as I said, there were no pitched battles. The volunteers had learned the lesson from 1916 that it was a mug's game to try to take on the British forces in any kind of direct confrontation, because the forces on the British side were so strong that there was no way any Irish revolutionary group could possibly match the British forces in open combat. So they had to rely on guerrilla warfare. So assassinations and what they call flying columns, where people, groups of volunteers, Irish volunteers, they eventually were called the IRA, but in the beginning they were called the Irish Volunteers. They, say ambushed police stations, then went on the run, and the British had great difficulty in tracking them down because they knew the local territory, they knew the local topography, and the British soldiers who were fresh into Ireland, or maybe members of the Black and Tans or the auxiliaries who were also, recruited specifically for the War of Independence, just didn't know the local scene the way that the Irish volunteers did. So they managed to fight a successful, or to mount a successful challenge to the British authorities in Ireland, despite the fact that they had vastly inferior forces. So the question is, how did the Irish side prevail? I would say a number of factors came into play. First, the volunteers showed a ruthless determination. They were not afraid to, for example, on Bloody Sunday in November 1919, they were not afraid to assassinate in their beds or in their homes or in their hotel rooms a dozen or more members of the British intelligence forces. So they were ruthless in the way they conducted this war. They were passionately committed to the cause that they were engaged in. A second point is that the British government was either unwilling or unable to unleash the full power of the British state against the Irish volunteers, because this would have involved a level of violence and repression that would have created major problems for the British government, not just internationally and the United States, where there would have been a huge backlash on the orchestrated by Irish Americans, but even in Britain itself, where a lot of people would have had doubts about the necessity and the morality of, inflicting such violence on Ireland as would have had to have been done in order to crush the Sinn Féin rebellion. And I think the final factor, as I mentioned, as I referred to just there, was that international opinion was important to the British in the 20th century in a way that it wouldn't have been in the 19th century. Had that rebellion broken out in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it would have been crushed because the British government wouldn't have had any reason to worry about the implications for its international reputation. But by the 20th century, that was a factor. And it is true, I think, that Sinn Féin won the battle for hearts and minds, and they won the propaganda battle. Because what happened was, when there were Sinn Féin assassinations or attacks on police barracks when policemen were killed, the retaliation that was taken by British forces, for example, the burning of Cork, the burning of Balbriggan, the killings at Croke Park on Bloody Sunday, all of those things were because they were undertaken by a state, by official forces of the British state, they simply served to alienate people further, and they created great sympathy for the Irish cause around the world. Another thing was the death on hunger strike of Terence MacSwiney. And I remember even in India in the 1980s, meeting people who remembered how the death of Terence MacSwiney had resonated with India at the time, which was also looking to assert its independence, but was a little bit behind Ireland in that regard. And of course, I remember on one occasion in 1982 or thereabouts, a man came into the embassy to show me a book he'd written, which was a translation into Hindi of Dan Breen's My Fight for Irish Freedom. So the Irish struggle became an international issue, and that, of course, put the British in a difficult position. So the ceasefire of July 1921 led on in December 1921 to the negotiations on the Anglo-Irish Treaty, to the treaty being agreed between the two sides, and then to a split in the Sinn Féin movement between those who were in favour of the treaty and those who opposed it. And that led on to the Civil War and left a legacy in the Irish political system, which has continued until almost the present day. Although now, of course, the two parties in government are parties that are descended from the opposing sides in the Irish Civil War, but it's taken 100 years for that coming together in government to happen. So, but those are issues that we will deal with in the subsequent events, subsequent sessions of A Farther Shore. But now I hand over to Mary McCain to introduce our panel, and I'll be happy to come in and comment as part of the panel as well. Thank you very much.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much. And I thank Kevin as well. A warm welcome to all of you from wherever you may be joining us. On that note, please recall Kevin's request that you type in your location. I think it will be a lot of fun if people will be willing to do that. And please don't feel forced, of course. And another quick reminder that Kevin had mentioned too, if you came late, the session is being recorded. I'm in Chicago too, Kevin. Thank you for starting us off there. I am just delighted and really very honored to be able to moderate and introduce this panel of, as Ambassador Mulhall mentioned, very distinguished scholars. I will introduce the three of them and then we'll begin the discussion, to which I look forward, and I'm sure you do as well. We have three panelists and I will take them seriatim. Dr. Mary McAuliffe is an assistant professor and lecturer in gender studies at University College Dublin. And indeed, she's joining us from Dublin. I'm so grateful that you're willing to burn the midnight oil to join us tonight. It's already Wednesday there. She specializes in Irish women's and gender history. Her most recent publication was a biography of the feminist, trade union activist, and revolutionary woman, Margaret Skinner, which was just published last year. She is the co-author and co-editor of works about the 1916 Rising and has published widely on many aspects of specialties, such as Irish women's history more broadly, gendered and sexual violence in war, memory and history, social and political history, and public history. She was a member of the National Museum of Ireland's Decade of Centenaries Commemoration Advisory Committee. Mary, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Tim McMahon is an associate professor of history at Marquette University in Milwaukee, just up the road from where I am. He is a past president of the American Conference for Irish Studies. Tim is a social historian with interest in nationalism and national identity, popular culture, especially popular religion, and empire. He is the co-author of Grand Opportunity, the Gaelic Revival and Irish Society, 1893-1910, and editor and co-editor of other works as well. His current project, for which he has received a fellowship from Marquette with which to facilitate his work, the current book project is about the impact of partition on identities all across the island of Ireland. Thank you, Tim. Welcome to you as well. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Justin Dolan Stover is an associate professor of history at Idaho State University, where he teaches courses on the transnational history of war and revolution with a specialty in Irish history. He is currently serving as treasurer of ACIS, the American Conference for Irish Studies. So when you join, I say if not when, to all the attendees, please send him your membership dues. Pardon me, his current research is looking at the environmental history of the Irish Revolution, and he has published on this topic, including The Political Ecology of Nationalist Literature, 1880 to 1922, which appeared in the Cambridge History of Irish Literature and the Environment, and a piece in a collection titled Paris, Capital of Irish Culture, France, Ireland, and the Republic, 1798-1916. His piece has the subtitle War Damage in Paris and Dublin. Justin, thank you so much for coming as well. So yes, as Kevin had mentioned to attendees, please keep your questions coming. I'm already writing feverishly, and we welcome those very much. But moderator's prerogative, I get to ask the questions at first. And Tim, I would like to start with you, if I may. This is kind of a deceptively straightforward question, but I think it is deceptive in its simplicity. What were the goals, plural, of this period of the Irish Revolution, the War of Independence, and to what extent do you see them having been achieved?
It is deceptive, Mary. Thank you so much. Thank you also, Ambassador, and to the Consul General in Chicago for hosting, and Ambassador for conceiving of this whole program this spring, winter and spring. To your question, Mary, I think, you know, at the center, particularly for the leadership of Sinn Fein, the aim was to have a 32-county Irish Republic, independent of the British state. That's a very straightforward statement, but if we go, for instance, to the very first day in Dáil Éireann, they declare their independence, and they essentially lay out that they're going to form an Irish Republic. They issue a democratic program, which also talks about social reforms, which I think is designed not only to reflect the ideology that so many of the revolutionaries had, but also to try and attract as many supporters as possible. To get away from the deception, start peeling back the layers just a bit, one of the things that I think is very apparent is that people supported not just Sinn Fein in that 1918 election, but the entire revolutionary program for a variety of reasons. If you go back to before that election, when Sinn Fein was running for office, they did not run to found a republic. They ran to create an independent Ireland with the specific shape of the government to be determined by the Irish people afterward, which is a significantly different thing. And it's one reason why I think it was very possible for former supporters of the Home Rule movement to gravitate towards Sinn Fein in those months leading up to the election. But there were many features about that period between 1916, the Rising, and 1918, the election, and then ultimately the war, that brought people together. As the ambassador said, the decade around this was an incredibly fervent time for various types of reform movements to be engaged in, whether we're talking about labor, women's rights, the perpetual issue of land and who owned the land in Ireland. All of these things came together, and depending on where you were on the island, you may have had allegiance to one or more of those issues. And so I think the best work, the most exciting work that's being done right now on the revolution is really intersectional, right? It's looking at multiple influences, multiple desires, and this all contributes, I think, to what I see as a push for independence, however we will ultimately define that.
Great, thank you so much. And Mary, could I ask you to sort of pick up on the same kind of question, particularly if we turn our focus to a smaller group within this broader context that Tim has referred to, Cumann, if you could maybe speak to what goal they may have been fighting for alongside the volunteers, and just bring us up to date on work currently on Cumann. Oh, and please unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
That's the perennial Zoom thing.
Absolutely.
Like with Tim, a deceptively simple question, but not so simple an answer. And greetings to everybody, and I'm delighted to join you even after midnight on Wednesday, the 24th, from a very stormy Dublin. So if you hear things rattling, that's just the roof lifting off my house.
Oh, no.
And so in terms of Cumann have a very interesting trajectory, and even a very interesting foundation in 1914, because of course it set up after the Irish Volunteers have been set up in the November previous 1913 to form a militant organization for men. And some women claim they were in it, but the Irish Volunteers generally didn't allow women to join. And Cumann, when it is set up in April 1914, is a deliberate construct by very already politicized women. And they do something very interesting and very sophisticated in their setting up of Cumann. They chart a centrist course, because there were quite a number of radicals, women, who would have perhaps not been women who would have seen themselves as auxiliaries to the Irish Volunteers, but they wanted to bring along as many women as they could with them. And so when you look at the first Cumann executive and the first Cumann manifesto, I suppose, they're women who, they have Agnes O'Farrelly, for example, who would have been a very respectable figure as their figurehead, more or less. They have people like Kathleen Clark, Jenny Weiss-Power, and many others on their executive. So they're a self-selected executive. Their manifesto talks about fundraising to arm a body of men to fight for Ireland, being auxiliaries to the Irish Volunteers, and, you know, really positioning themselves as secondary in many ways to the Irish Volunteers, which of course completely annoyed the feminists at the time, the suffragettes, who I think it was Hannah She Skeffington called them animated collection boxes. So there is that argument between the political women at the time, whether you were a nationalist feminist or a feminist nationalist, you know, suffrage first or nation first. And that argument rumbled on for quite a while. In fact, if Pori Coleman, they would leave for New York sometime soon after the foundation of Cumann, writes a very virulent defense of Cumann on the back of the accusations of the suffrage women that they were, you know, slavishly following the men, that even if the Irish Volunteers didn't exist, the women of Ireland would fight for the freedom of Ireland. And I'm paraphrasing here, it's quite a long letter. And I think that tension in Cumann continued in its first year or two, coming up to 1916. Although its militancy is always evident in its symbols, in its uniform, in its badge, the Cumann initials with the rifle. and its activities, you know, participating in the O'Donovan Rossa funeral procession. And many young women in Dublin particularly talk about seeing the Cumann na mBan women marching in that, and that's the reason they then joined Cumann na mBan. So militancy is there, and it's a really strong aspect of Cumann na mBan, but their ideology is only at this time beginning to progress. And of course, then we know about 300 women participate in the 1916 Rising, the majority of them from Cumann na mBan. Interestingly, the most radical women, the women who were leaning towards the left, influenced by Connolly, perhaps you know, leaning towards socialism, the Kathleen Lynns, Madeleine French Mullins, Countess Markievicz, my own, the woman I wrote about, Margaret Skinner, they don't join Cumann na mBan. They join the Irish Citizen Army, because the Citizen Army see themselves, well, the women in the Citizen Army feel there's an equality there that's absent for the women of Cumann na mBan. I think then, though, after the Rising and after all the traumas of that and the executions, and particularly because of the promise of equality in the proclamation, and the proclamation is vital for these women, and it will continue to be vital for them for the rest of their lives, really, you know, particularly after the Irish Free State turns out to be no country for women. And they hark back to that promise of equality again and again and again as legislation and social policies are introduced to position women within the domestic in the Irish Free State. But the women of Cumann na mBan become the leaders de facto after the Rising, where most of the men are in prison. So you see them, you know, women like Kathleen Clark getting the organizations back together again and setting up the various fundraising organizations to help the families of those imprisoned or those executed, but also to reorganize. And indeed, Kathleen Clark is a very, very important woman, and she's the one who promotes Collins. And is, you know, one of the big reasons why Collins becomes such an important figure post-Rising. Then you have the Republican women who go on the tours in America in 1917 and 1918 and bring that propaganda to America. Nora Connolly, Margaret Skinner, Hannah Shee Skeffington. She gets in to see the president, Woodrow Wilson. So they're very effective and very impactful. And I would argue that the election of 1918 is a huge success for Sinn Fein, in no small part due to the women's vote, which was delivered for Sinn Fein by Cumann na mBan and by the activities of Cumann na mBan. And by 1918 themselves, Cumann na mBan are more avowedly feminist. Their first line in their manifesto is to make sure that the women take up their position as promised in the proclamation of 1916, and more avowedly militant. They're now arming a body of men and women to fight for Ireland. So they have an idea of what they want and where they're going. What they're fighting for is a 32-county Irish Republic. And I suppose in many ways, I'm jumping, you know, because we'll go back to the War of Independence, I guess, again in the talk. I'm jumping to the Civil War and Cumann na mBan's take on the treaty. The fact that that proclamation becomes so central to the women of Cumann na mBan and what they are fighting for, I would see it very difficult for them to accept anything less than a 32-county Irish Republic. And what they really fall out on, not so much the border, although that does annoy them, is the oath of allegiance. And Margaret Skinner, again, going back to her, says at the meeting when Cumann na mBan considered the treaty that any Irishman who takes an oath of allegiance to a foreign crown cannot be considered an Irishman subsequent to that. So Cumann na mBan begins fairly centrist, becomes militant very, very quickly, and I would argue radicalizes post-Rising to become a militant, separatist, 32-county Ireland supporting organisation that can only reject the treaty for the most part when it considers it in 1921.
Thank you. I appreciate that response very much. And it makes me think of a number of other questions, but I will narrow it to one for Justin. Could I ask you to sort of build on this notion of other movements that become sort of part of the War of Independence? I think of the labor movement, the movement for land reform that Tim had mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, by the way. It's nice to see so many people tuning in from Detroit, just out in my hometown. The question posed, yeah, what were the goals of this period? That's really opens quite a lot for discussion. And because we might say, well, on a macro level, or what we've seen and what we've been taught from history, the goals are very lofty and political and ideological. But at the local level and on the personal level, the goals would be far more intimate, I think, and in regarding issues such as labor or the acquisition of land or continued transfers of land under the essentially the framework of the Wyndham Land Act and everything. The concerns of the period might be a lot more intimate. And in that regard, I think we need to think about the War of Independence and the broader period in more human terms. The goal might be just to keep your head down. The goal might not to be having been seen as being friendly with police or with soldiers so as to maintain your pane glass window in the front of your shop or something like that. And so Labour is said at the time to have taken a willing kind of second role in order to allow the framework of a revolutionary government to be formed and then insert itself afterwards. And Thomas Johnson, the Labour leader, even around the early 1920s, is talking about the need to recognize that independence means a start, not a finish. We have buildings to repair, we have local councils to embody with power to widen roads and to provide electricity and things like that. And so the wider movements, and particularly for land, the War of Independence and the violence that accompanies it creates sort of a fog in some parts of the country, particularly where the RIC had been withdrawn. It essentially, I won't say lawless, because Republican police then fill that void in some ways, but it does give rise to the opportunity for people to seize land, to carry out, I guess, vendettas that have been left over from the land war of the late 19th century. So the goals in this regard, I think, need to be pluralized in a lot of ways. And I know that for the sake of brevity, as we speak and as we write, particularly, people don't want to see this kind of spectrum go off, but it's not as neat and tidy, I think, as we'd like it to be.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. And it reminds me, I meant to tell the attendees at the beginning that I gave the panelists very strict time, a very strict talk about how long their answers should be. There so much more could be said about any of these things for sure. But thank you so far. So that's the end of round one. I turn now to round two, and I'm going to start again with Tim, if I may. The response, and Ambassador Mulhall and Mary and Justin, we've all mentioned this, but the response of the Crown forces to this situation, could you speak a little to whether it's strategy, or perhaps that's plural too, strategies for addressing this ended up doing them much service, so to speak? Did it help or hinder the goals of the London government? And then I'll turn to Mary and ask another question there as well. Did I ask a question? I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
you did ask a question. I just kept failing to get unmuted. The Crown government performed a number of different operations to try and respond to what was happening in Ireland. So if we use the framework that I think is often used with reference to, even from the period of the land war forward, coercion on the one hand and conciliation on the other hand. If we're talking about conciliation, one element that they're trying to do is to offer self-government within the context of the United Kingdom. So Home Rule had passed and was the law of the land in 1914, but it was suspended for the duration of the war. And there had been a promise that there would be some concession taken for unionist opinion, whether that meant partition or county option or whatever. That was still sort of unclear, in spite of the fact that in response to the Rising in 1916, there had been a proposed partition, which would not have actually created a parliament in Northern Ireland. It would have, the 6 counties would have remained directly governed from London. That, of course, didn't happen. So there is a Government of Ireland Act which is brought forward in 1920. That is actually what partitions the island. It establishes the 6-county state and a 26-county state, which for all intents and purposes is a dead letter because the War of Independence is going on. And only the treaty at the end will create even a more independent state than was on offer from that conciliatory legislation. Now, there was a great deal of coercion. So let's talk about this. In addition to the constabulary on the ground, the military that was on the ground, as Justin just said, there was a great deal of pullback from rural barracks of the constabulary. The Irish Volunteers took advantage of that. In 1920 alone, according to a report the RIC put out at the end of the year, some 531 barracks were burned, destroyed. So that there's a great deal more freedom of movement, if you will, for the volunteers and for those who are supporting them. So how do you meet that? Well, one of the ways you meet that, if you're the Crown State, is you begin to recruit reinforcements. And in the spring of 1920, they recruit new members of the constabulary that we call the Black and Tans. They are further reinforced in the summer from August on by another group, the Auxiliary Cadets, which were in fact a mobile force. And by then the IRA is moving into this concept of flying columns, and so you essentially have flying columns from the Crown side as well. The other element that is coercive, and we should definitely talk about the violence and the reprisals carried out by those forces over the course of the next bit of time. But the other area that is, I think, under discussed is the use of arrests. So in 1920, you also have a great deal of coordination between constabulary intelligence on the one hand and military intelligence on the other hand. And the use of internment in 1920 is very extensive. So much so that at the time that the treaty is signed in December of 1921, you still have 7,000 Irish men and women being held by Crown forces. If Collins is going to use a figure like 3,000 active people, there's at least 7,000 others who are being detained by the Crown. And their cases become cause celebs for, if you will, nonviolent actors. People being held in Mountjoy. You've got women on the street very actively protesting. You've got labor activists who are engaging in general strikes. So the Crown continues to have to adjust its own actions because, frankly, the revolutionaries are adjusting theirs as well.
Thank you very much. When I hear the word internment, I think immediately of Northern Ireland, of course. And so it's striking to me, I wasn't fully aware of its use in this war as well. So thank you. Excuse me, this is not about what I think. What I would like to do is ask Mary, if I may quickly, the Crown and the IRA combatants too, both sought to control or police women's activity if they felt it was hindering their own cause. And I know some new work is being done by yourself and others perhaps as well on this topic. And then I would like a heads up to all the panelists if we'll shift from there, speaking of atrocities, to people of both genders, excuse me, to the global witnessing of this and how that impinges on the island of Ireland itself. So thank you, Mary.
Yes, yes, there was violence, gendered violence and targeted violence against women is very much part of this, but I can't speak this evening without mentioning the fact that today is the centenary anniversary of the burning of my mother's home village, February 23rd, 1921, by the Black and Tans, Ballylongford in North County Kerry, in a reprisal for the killing of a RIC constable the day before in the village by an ASU branch of the North Kerry, or the Kerry number 1. brigade. And in that, about 20 houses in a small village were burned. And you get descriptions of the terror visited on the civilian population, men, women, and children, but mostly women and children, because, of course, the men could easily go on the run. A year before, in the same village, one evening, again in a reprisal, the RIC had surrounded the church when mostly women and children were at evening devotions. And as they came out, and it's a long alleyway, same church that's still there, they had to walk through a sort of surrounded by the RIC, who battened them out of the church. So that was the type of civilian coercion and I suppose intimidation and reprisal that was happening throughout the period, particularly through the summer of 1920 and on into 1921. But in terms of violence against women, interestingly, we talk about memory is about the drunken hands, and the drunken hands carrying out reprisals against women, forcible hair cropping, sexual harassment, and worse. Lil Conlon in her book talks about insults and indignities that women suffered. And when you think about it, there were just over 49,000 homes raided in 1920. Most of those homes were occupied by women and children. If there were men being looked for, most of these men were already on the run, so they were gone. So it is women and children who are really on that front line of reprisal and intimidation by the Crown forces. And we have examples of both women who are militant women and are targeted as members of Cumann na mBan for physical violence and hair cropping, and then just women in communities that are suspected of providing aid and support and comfort for the flying columns or IRA men on the run that are targeted. But then on the other hand, you also have the IRA, and indeed in my research, it's pointing that the majority of hair cropping attacks, forcible hair cutting attacks, done during the period late 1919 to early 1921 was done by the IRA. There is a spike then between late 1921 and into 1922 in the border counties and Belfast as part of the violence there that's done equally by the B Specials and Sinn Fein Republican or IRA people. But during the main part of the War of Independence, it is IRA men. And why are they doing this? They're attacking women if they're barrack servants. So these are poor working class women who have this job, a very steady, secure job, probably the only income many of their families would have. It's part of the RIC boycott. And they are physically attacking them, they're beating them up, and they're cropping their hair, they're sending threatening letters. They're attacking young girls who might be walking out with soldiers for company keeping. And there's an interesting moral underpinning of this sort of attack by the IRA. And when we think about these, we have to think about these are the men who are then going to be the leaders in the new Irish Free State, in which that moralizing about women's bodies and women's sexuality becomes common. And you see this already. So we are moving away from that moment of radical promise of equality, even during the War of Independence, when women are fighting for what they think is that republic proclaimed in 1916. And the violence against women is extreme. I mean, hair cropping may not sound very violent, but usually it happens late at night between 5, 10, 15, 20 men masked and armed coming to a house, dragging a girl outside the house, surrounding her. We know her hair is cropped. What else happens has to be unpacked in the language, because the words used are outrage, insult, indignity, indecent assault sometimes, but rarely any other word. We have evidence of some rapes, but not an awful lot. But I would argue that absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence, because who's going to be making complaints to whom about these? And some recent research have turned up some evidence that complaints were taken to Sinn Féin courts about assaults on women, and the RIC. I was looking at the RIC records, and they said the women would not cooperate with us even though they had been attacked. because, of course, they did not want to cooperate, both for their own safety, but also they may have been ideologically opposed to cooperating with the RIC. So all of this violence is going on, and I think it changes the narrative somewhat when we integrate that into our revolutionary story. And, you know, in its very simplistic fashion, you have two bodies of men fighting across the bodies of women in the country. In a more complicated way, there's all sorts of reasons why violence is being committed specifically towards women.
Thank you. Yes, I have to gather myself slightly on this, but the topic of atrocities definitely is being explored more today, very fruitfully, but it was not entirely unknown, I think, by the global community that this was happening in Ireland at this time. And so if I could shift now, and I'll turn to Justin. Justin, could you speak about the way the French-speaking world, the Francophone world, was looking at this moment in Ireland?
Absolutely. And this is one of my favorite topics, is that we think about a farther shore. The waves of the Irish Revolution are lapping all over the world at this time. But what I find is that French attention to Irish affairs is very, very prevalent at the turn of the 20th century, having to do with imperial security and Ireland as the back door to Britain and things like that. They're very interested about the Home Rule debate because they're dealing with their own demands from the Bretons. Oh, they call it regionalism, but a regional parliament that would recognize the autonomy of a distinct cultural people. But it's the high politics of the democratic program and the Declaration of Independence that resonate through, I guess you'd say, just mainstream moderate French newspapers. But it's the hunger strike of Terence MacSweeney and his colleagues that really bring the spotlight onto the Irish situation, as does the reprisals and the burnings of towns. And the reason this is because it is very shocking to, I think, a French public who's been told that their allies, Britain, are fighting for the rights of small nations for so many years, and then behaving in this way. So a lot of commenters from the French Quarter, not merely in Paris, but elsewhere as well, comment on the moral bankruptcy that Britain is displaying in these actions. And the Francophone world, even outside of France, is not ignorant to this, not merely because of certain aid societies that go to Ireland to investigate, and there's some that come from the United States, Labour delegates from Britain as well, but French newspapers send their own journalists to investigate. Simone Terry is one of the best recorded cases of this. I think her report is Raids and Reprisals, in which she investigates sacked towns and everything. But the reporting of this back is very matter of fact, but it's always couched in this kind of moral language. Now, the extent of this, as I said, isn't just in the mini Irish diaspora in and around Paris, and it's not merely being fed by the Dáil Éireann diplomats, Sinn Féin diplomats, George Gavin Duffy, Sean T. O'Kelly, and things like that, but indeed places as far away, I guess, is French North Africa. Their newspapers are repeating these stories. They don't necessarily have their own journalists on the ground, but they are being repeated. And this great collection at the National Library, the manuscript section, had a collection of, I believe it was called Argent du Presse. The Irish diplomats abroad wanted to know what the French were reporting and if it was the right line to be repeating. And Terence MacSweeney's hunger strike is the event that explodes across the columns of French newspapers of any and every political shade. Other events, obviously the treaty and the conclusion of that and diplomacy are reported, but it's the outrages that get the most press lines, as it probably does today as well.
Perhaps, right. And I think also in America too, Tim, could I ask you to talk to the American response in this moment, and particularly the Irish American response?
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. a couple of things to pick up on right there too. The Irish-American response was really targeted through a number of different groups, including the Friends of Irish Freedom. And then there was a split off. Eamon de Valera was touring the United States for a good bit of the War of Independence, and he had a falling out with leaders of the Friends of Irish Freedom and created his own organization with the really long and difficult name of the American Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic. But the American activity helped to raise over $5.5 million toward the Doyle loan, which helped to facilitate revolutionary activity. But it was facilitated not just by de Valera. I mean, there were a whole host. I mean, Mary brought up before women who toured the U.S. in 17 and 18. Women touring the United States from Ireland would continue well after the Civil War. We can think of people like, Mary McSweeney is one of the ones who's very well known. Muriel McSweeney before and in the midst of the war. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington multiple times. Countess Markovitz, Margaret Pierce, Kathleen Boland. I mean, there's just a whole slew of people who kept bringing the Irish issue before the American public. And this is a critically important element of the Irish story. And again, if we think about the pre-War of Independence and the early days of the War of Independence, you also had a host of other more radical Irish revolutionaries who were in the United States. People like Liam Mellows, for instance, who had come here after the Easter Rising. So the Irish-American element here is critically important to supporting the Irish cause financially, and also providing an avenue for looking at what's happening. So again, investigating the violence and the reprisals. There were American commissions that came over to try and investigate what was happening. There were Americans in Ireland at the time that Cork was burned, for instance. But there were also British audiences that were paying a great deal of attention to this too. The Irish in Britain, through the Irish Self-Determination League, were publicizing events here as well. This was very important, even to organizing street protests, for instance, when Irish prisoners were being held at Wormwood Scrubs in April and May of 1920. Some of those internees. You actually had street fighting outside Wormwood Scrubs as Londoners who opposed the Irish Self-Determination League marching around the prison came to beat up the ISDL. So whether it was Irish America, Irish in Britain, the French, and then let's think about the wider British Empire. You have outbreaks of violence in Egypt, in India, in Mesopotamia, and in almost all of those areas, the British are also seeing it as echoes of what's happening in Ireland. They're worried about the Egyptian Sinn Fein or the Indian Sinn Fein. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. And Ireland becomes a focal point in those years for the potential of revolutionary violence. And it's one key reason why the British cannot crack down even more than I think they would have otherwise.
They might have otherwise, right? Thank you. Well, panelists, many, many thanks. I now have the pleasure, but the very difficult task of moderating the questions from the audience that I will now direct to you. And so to the attendees, please, I beg your pardon in advance if we don't get to your question. We could go on till midnight Chicago time, not simply midnight Dublin time, but we will be more disciplined than that. So the very first question that came in, and I'd invite any of you to unmute yourself to address, is how did, and it's, excuse me, the question is this, and you will see its connection to our present time. How did the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 affect this period in Ireland?
like
Justin,
to phone a
thank
friend.
you.
I'd like to phone Ida Milne,
Oh, yes, yes, of course.
whose wonderful book on the topic is certainly worth picking up and reading. I myself, in my own research, only came across instances of the flu as they affected political prisoners in select instances. And I think Belfast prison, late 1918, is one time in which there was a man who was feared to be infected and they had to clear people out, and the political prisoners used this as an excuse to smash up doors and to cause a ruckus and things. But in my own research, I hadn't come across it very much, but I do recommend Ida Milne's book on the subject.
Actually, Mary, I wrote a piece a few months ago for the Irish Times on W.B. Yeats's brush with the pandemic in 1918-19, because his father caught the flu in New York, and he was in his 70s at the time, and then his wife caught it when she was pregnant with their daughter. And at the time, when I was doing my research for that article, I looked up all the standard histories of the period, all the standard Irish history that I have here in my personal library, and I could find almost no reference to the pandemic. It's as if it left almost no mark. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. You know, it was much more deadly than even the current pandemic, which has caused such havoc around the world. But the 1918 flu was much worse. But it doesn't seem to have left much of a mark in terms of the historians writing about the period. Maybe it's because it coincided with the War of Independence and therefore was overshadowed by the War of Independence, and nothing got a look in. In my article, I speculated that maybe Yeats' Second Coming, which was written just after he'd had this brush with the pandemic and could have lost his wife and father to the flu, that it might have affected him in writing the Second Coming. But that was just speculation. I have no evidence to back it up.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mary, were you?
Yes, there definitely was a propaganda effect of the 1918 flu, particularly when a few of the prisoners in British jails died of the flu. So you had a few propaganda funerals. And of course, because they died in British jails, the fact that it was the flu was sort of overlooked, and these were martyrs for the cause because they had died as Sinn Fein inmates in British jails. And I can't, one of them was Pierce, cannot recall his second name, but again, as Justin said, read Ida's book Stacking the Coffins, and I think Ida and one or two others have rewritten the Spanish flu or the global influenza at the time back into our histories. And I would agree with the ambassador. I think because it coincided with the ending of the First World War and the beginning of the War of Independence, it sort of gets forgotten about in all of that flurry of revolutionary or war history. But it really has an impact, particularly on, for example, people like Kathleen Lynn, who was able to come back from internal exile in Britain because she was needed to start ministering to the poor in Dublin. And so you see a sort of loosening up of some of the regulations, the DORA regulations on some people who were necessary. But it was one way that the Sinn Féiners as well could prove their worth in providing aid and comfort during the flu pandemic as well. So it was a useful propaganda trope as well.
Thank you. And speaking of Sinn Féin, there is a fair bit of interest in the questions in Sinn Féin's victory in 1918. A couple of different questions. One, a person asked, having gained only 46% of the vote, how did it feel that it had this sort of mandate, or how did it have the confidence to form a government? And I think that is partly due to the fact that they won a greater number of seats than that percentage of the total vote might suggest. But excuse me, the other question is, had they sort of notified the electorate that this would be their plan if they were elected to Westminster, that they would in fact stay in Dublin? Was this part of the election campaign?
Yeah.
I'll jump in on that right away. From Sinn Féin's foundation, their their raison d'etre was to found a government back in Ireland. Essentially, you know, as the name implies, ourselves alone. If we are elected, we will become a self-governing people. That's essentially at the heart of the Sinn Fein program. So yes, they were clear about that. What they weren't clear about was that they were going to formally declare a republic immediately. But they were very clear about that from the first day of the Dáil met. I mean, they made their declaration of independence. They established that this is what they were going to set out to do. And it is interesting too, like if you start to look at things like like local government elections, and the way that Sinn Féin begins to sweep local government elections in subsequent time during the midst of the War of Independence. Now, is that partly because there's a guerrilla war going on and people are afraid to vote a particular way? You know, I mean, I've heard that argued, but I think it's fair to say as well that they might be afraid to vote Sinn Féin, given the fact that Crown forces are going around and literally hauling people out of their beds and firing over their heads in the middle of the street. So I think that was a conscious choice that voters were making, that they in fact did endorse the concept of an Irish government.
Yeah, I'd agree with Tim there. And sorry, I had to move. My battery was about to die.
I was afraid your roof had come off. I'm glad it's only the battery.
Yes.
Did you want to echo Tim?
Yes, I would agree with Tim there. I think that local government election, people talk about the legitimacy of the Revolutionary War, and you know, it's not based on any constitutional agreement that the electorate gave Sinn Féin in 1918, but I think you can see that they do give that to Sinn Féin in the subsequent local government election, where they could have made choices about who and who they did support, and you do see Sinn Féin getting majority support there, and so at that stage, I think the civilian population was behind the revolutionary struggle, whether they were or not initially, or whether if Sinn Féin had ran on a, you know, militant ticket rather than an abstentionist ticket in 1918 is kind of a moot point, because as the ambassador said in his introduction, Solohead Beg was not a sanctioned event in January 1919. So the War of Independence kind of accidentally broke out. But things were leading up to it at that stage. You know, that isn't, although we see them as the first shots, there'd already been a few raids for arms happening in late 1918. So violence was beginning to ratchet up a little bit. And then you had men like Dan Breen and, you know, Sean Hogan and others who were determined to carry the fight. So, you know, at that stage, if people had any awareness of politics, they probably would have known violence was going to be part and parcel of an abstentionist government in Dublin at that stage.
To pick up on that point, Mary, you know, one of the things that Breen says in his autobiography is that one reason why they did think that they needed to push the violence was that they were worried that more moderate people in the Dáil might have success, and so they had to push harder. But as you say as well, I mean, there were firings on police at least as early as August of 1918. So, you know, Solohead Beg is the headline in part because of the coincidence of the 21st of January. But you know, I mean, I think things were moving already, at least in some districts, toward that kind of violence.
Great, thank you. Staying with this sort of World War I and its impact kind of question, kinds of questions, were former Irish soldiers who had served in the British Army during World War I a significant factor, or the Navy, excuse me, a significant factor in the success of the independence movement militarily and or politically? And a related question, did that just wrenching and grueling experience that any combatant nation in World War I had, did it sort of, perhaps if I read the question correctly, sap the British desire to quash this independence movement in Ireland as, you know, strongly, harshly, excuse me, as they might have done?
Ooh.
Justin.
This is a fun one.
I teed it up right for you. No, actually the participant did.
Yeah. So first of all, check out Jane Leonard's work on some of the returned soldiers that go to join the IRA. Not necessarily a numerically significant influx, but they're sought out as they are in the foundation of the Irish Volunteers in 1913, as the Ulster Volunteers do as well, because of their expertise in not merely in, say, warfare, but we're talking about individuals who are teaching the IRA how to form fours, how to march, military parlance, things of that nature. And then if you can get your hands on a rifle or, you know, God willing, a machine gun or something, how to maintain that, clean it, find the right caliber of bullets for it. But to the second point, this is where I kind of want to challenge this and be a bit provocative to say the IRA did not defeat the British Army in the field. And I don't think anyone suggested that, but we keep talking about the military victory. And I think that what we need to take into account is that the IRA didn't have to hold a position. They didn't have to occupy space like we would think of a I guess, contemporary army or a modern army. All they had to do was frustrate the British administration and the Crown Force's ability to enforce that administration. And so, as we said before, the pulling back of police, that's essentially a capitulation to say we no longer control this area. Now, the IRA doesn't have to occupy it. They just have to not have police there or a presence. But the question of did the First World War wear down soldiers who, by the time they got to Ireland, were very tired? I think the opposite happened. I think without a uniformed enemy to shoot at, without knowing where your enemy was, when they were coming, what notes were being passed to which housekeeper, who then gave them to this person, other, that was frustrating. And even accounts of the time, who are kind of apologists for the outrages and reprisals we see, write about the psychological strain that's on the British Crown Forces. And they write of this time and time again, into which that the oral environment, the backfiring of a car, the slamming of a door is startling people because of this very unorthodox way of attempting to engage an enemy that doesn't seem to be present.
Yep. I think you also have to take into account that a sort of shadow state is operating as well. So it's frustrating any attempts by the British state to impose its rules and regulations on the population in many parts of the country, particularly in Munster and up along the west coast. Until the truce. So you have the Dáil courts, you have Republican police, you have local government effectively running the areas themselves. And you also have, you know, what Justin was saying, that this guerrilla warfare, I suppose that's what we call it, this guerrilla warfare is not what the former soldiers who are not now in the auxiliaries or the Black and Tans, or indeed the military Crown Forces themselves, are not used to fighting. You know, an enemy that disappears, that melds into the mist and into the bogs and is not wearing a uniform, and could be the young fella you see cycling up towards you on a bicycle, or anybody at all in a bog or in a field. And that's why maybe some civilians were shot accidentally because they failed to stop. And that was a big thing that the Crown Forces were always getting in trouble about, or being reported about, was failure to stop at checkpoints. And so people get shot there because, of course, they could be in a flying column. They could be part of the IRA. I also think we have to take into account, particularly for the ex-soldiers in the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans, and when we look at their extreme violence, part of it is frustration. I would absolutely agree with that. They can't see who they're fighting. They don't know who they're fighting. But I think we also have to recognize that some of them may have had PTSD. from their experiences in the First World War. I mean, you have to remember an awful lot of those who had been soldiers had been through the trauma of the Western Front. And they are now fighting this, they're in their 6th, 7th, 8th year of violence. Violence is a way of life for them. You know, that's how they react to people now. That's their thing. And so carrying out that extreme violence on civilian populations, on women and children and non-militants, can be explained in some part in that. I'm not saying it can be explained away, but it can be understood in some part on that PTSD and that reaction to their life of violence. That's who they are now.
Thank you.
Mary, if I could just jump in here really quick. I know we're up against time here, but I think just to build on those 2 points, when these are the representatives of the Crown state that the average Irish person sees, if there had been any doubt of where their loyalty was in 1918, by the end of 1920 and into 1921, their loyalties are not going to be with the fellows that are coming down the street shooting indiscriminately, right? And I mean, this is something that I think absolutely must be brought through here too, because for me, the critical thing about the Irish Revolution is not necessarily a military victory, because as Justin said, that doesn't come. The victory is there is a change in mentality among enough Irish people that they are determined to be a self-governing state.
Yes.
Home rule will no longer be sufficient.
It's not enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of these events. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I couldn't have scripted that ending any better if I had really written it all out. So thank you all. Tim is right. This part, don't go away, audience. This part has wrapped up. We have had a number of questions that I couldn't get to, and I do apologize. But one is, if I'm going to ask each panelist, put you on the spot a little bit. We are getting a lot of requests for book titles. Some of them have already been dropped into the chat for sure, but could you each maybe offer 1 or 2 titles and authors, and then, and remember, this is being recorded, so attendees can go back and find these things.
Yeah, I think you would be very happy to read Michael Laffin's book, The Definitive History of the Sinn Fein Party, The Resurrection of Ireland, which is a play off the title of Arthur Griffith's book, The Resurrection of Hungary. But I would also suggest Michael Hopkinson's short but concise and very good volumes on the War of Independence, and then he has a separate book on the Civil War period. But the book I use in my graduate seminar on the Irish Revolution is Marie Coleman's book, very, very short book, just titled The Irish Revolution. Gets into a lot of the issues that we're talking about here, which aren't typically orthodox for the period. So gendered violence, there it is. There it is. It should be on everyone's shelf. In fact, Tim, there it is. It should be on everyone's shelf. There you go. Marie, you owe me a coffee or something like that. But those are the few titles there. And I mean, the Amazon algorithm will suggest other titles, I'm sure, and we'll hear that you are talking about this, and it'll be in your dreams later, your subconscious.
Mary?
I'm sorry. Well, I always go back to the book, I suppose, that introduced me to Coming On, and that would be Margaret Ward's book on unmanageable revolutionaries. It set the stage for a revival, or a beginning of women's revolutionary history, and that was in the mid-1980s. It's been reissued once or twice since, and her books on Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington's political writings. I would agree with I have Marie Coleman's book, but it's in my office, so I can't show it. And I also think Gemma Clark's Everyday Violence in the Civil War, which shows and I'm very interested in that social history, what was happening in communities, in towns, in villages, to people who weren't necessarily the political leaders or involved in other than maybe as supporters in the actual militant side of the revolution. And so what happened in those communities, and that's very interesting to me. So I would recommend those, yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
And I'll throw two other titles out. One that gets at sort of the complexities of the revolutionary generation would be Roy Foster's Vivid Faces, which I think is a great read. And then another, which I'm so glad I got just at Christmas, is this brand new book that Linda Connolly edited. You probably can't see it, Women in the Irish Revolution. In fact, Mary McAuliffe is in there. Marie Coleman's in there as well. Margaret Ward's in there. Linda herself, a host of terrific writers that really get at new sources and the really important gendering of conflict in Ireland, and putting it into a broader context of the gendering of warfare. That is an exciting new area of research, indeed, for historians generally.
And actually, can I add to that now before we finish, because it's just out. It's a book edited by Una Frawley, and it's just simply called Women in the Decade of Commemorations. And many of the same writers are in that as well. Linda, myself, Margaret Ward, and others, writing about how this decade of commemorations has been so important for interest in and advancement in research and writing of gendered and women's history of this revolutionary period.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm just about to turn it back over to the ambassador, but with very sincere thanks to the panelists. And also, I was remiss when I first spoke in not thanking Vice Consul Sarah Keating and Emily Spielman of the embassy team in Washington for helping me in a million ways, but particularly so tonight. I also thank the American Conference for Irish Studies and its Midwestern branch, but the organization more broadly. Ambassador, I turn it over to you for some closing remarks. Thank you. Please unmute. Yep, I'll remute.
I just I'm because I have another job to do, my day job. I tend to use chapters in books. So I read recently again FSL Lyon's chapter on the revolutionary period in the New History of Ireland, volume 6, Ireland under the Union. And then, of course, the Cambridge History of Ireland has a very good chapter on the War of Independence by Fergal McGarry. And then I also tend to use The Transformation of Ireland by Dermot Ferriter, which has some very good stuff on the revolutionary period. But just as a closing few points, just to say that I have been interested in this period since I first came across it when I was at college in Cork in the 1970s, and I had a lifelong interest in it. And you know what really strikes me is the extraordinary achievement. I mean, you know, you can argue, you know, one way or the other. You can say, well, it should have been different, or it should have been that way, or you know, it was wrong to do what they did. And you know, John Bruton, for example, argues that you know, we could have become independent without you know, 1916 and all that followed. But you know, that what happened was an extraordinary achievement in my view, because there was no guarantee after the Easter Rising was crushed. There was no guarantee that those who were released from jail in 1916 and 17 would have been able to recreate or to create a national movement of the scale and effectiveness as a Sinn Féin movement in the period between 1916 and 1922. It wasn't a given that Ireland would resurrect itself. I mean, you know, the smart money at that time was probably on, you know, the parliamentarians coming back into the fray and delivering some form of home rule for Ireland. That's what, for example, D.P. Moran, who was no shrinking violet, the editor of The Leader, his argument in 1916 was, okay, these guys, you know, noble people and did a great job and have to admire them and I really support them. But we now need the wise old heads of the Irish Party to come and deliver something for us based on what had been done in 1916. So no guarantee. And yet they managed to create a political and military movement that, you know, challenged the might of the British Empire, you know, and in a way that was, if you compare it with the fairly miserable performance of Irish revolutionaries in the 19th century, this was a stunning achievement to be able to eventually persuade the British government, which had just won the greatest war or the biggest war in human history, to persuade them to actually negotiate. I mean, where in the annals of history is there an example of an empire, of the power and might of the British Empire in the period after the First World War, when it was a victorious power? Where in history is there an example of that kind of power being willing to negotiate with a group of revolutionaries who had very little capacity to really challenge that empire? And it all has to do with the change of atmosphere, the change of mentality, not just in Britain and Ireland, but also around the world, that the kind of thing that was possible in the 19th century just wasn't feasible. And even though there were hardliners in the British cabinet, Walter Long and Henry Wilson, who would have been happy to unleash the dogs of war in Ireland, and that's what Lloyd George threatened to do, but he never had any intention of doing that, because he realized that it wasn't really feasible for Britain to use the full weight of its military might on the people of Ireland, because you simply wouldn't have had buy-in from British people even for that kind of activity in the wake of the First World War. So, and then, the whole thing about the justification, did the volunteers and the IRA have a mandate from the people of Ireland to shoot members of the Royal Irish Constabulary or members of the British Army, or to shoot suspected informers or whatever? The answer is no, they didn't. We're talking here about the fog of war. I mean, we talk about the fog of war. That's a conventional war where, things happen on the battlefield that can't be controlled. But that's in a situation where you have an established government and a chain of command that everyone accepts. Even then, you get, the fog of war takes over, and things happen that are not really intended from the center. In Ireland, in that period, you had a number of different chains of command. You had the Minister of Defence, Cathal Brugha, trying to assert the control of the parliamentarians of Dáil Éireann over the volunteers in the field. You had GHQ, General HQ of the volunteers in Dublin, doing their own thing and basically being contemptuous of these politicians that weren't really up to very much, or were willing to compromise in the way that the volunteer leadership didn't want to do. Then you had the IRB influence and Michael Collins and his people. And then most of all, you had local initiatives. A lot of what happened in the War of Independence was basically locally generated. It had complex motivations behind it, not all. And these people were not taking direct orders from authority in Dublin, but they were all part of a general movement which ultimately produced the outcome it produced, which was the independence of Ireland and the partition of Ireland, has to be said. But those are issues that we will get on to in the subsequent events, the subsequent discussions in this series, a farther shore. But what I would just finally say is that the Irish achievement of securing independence from a successful empire was really a groundbreaker, which paved the way for the subsequent undermining and disintegration of the European empires, which happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. The Irish experience was unlike the experience of, say, the Czech Republic or Poland or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, that basically became independent because the empires they were part of fell apart and they emerged into statehood using old national identities, of course, but not having to fight for independence against a country that wanted to hold on and had the power to hold on, it seemed. And, the British, they genuinely believed that if Ireland managed to secure full independence, that would result in the disintegration of the British Empire. And to some extent, that's what happened, because within 10 years of Ireland becoming independent, the Irish Free State was active, along with the other dominions, in changing the nature of the British Empire and making it into more like a free association of nations rather than an empire as such. So the Irish Revolution did have an international effect of significant proportions. And I'll tell you this: when I was in India in 1982, I met the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and she told me, and she's written this in her book, in her biography, The Scope of Happiness. She was a very significant figure in the Indian independence movement, and again as a diplomat for India after independence. And she said that for her generation, born around the turn of the century, the First World War passed them by. For her, the first activation of her political identity was when she witnessed the hunger strike, or the death on hunger strike of Terence McSweeney in London in 1919. And that was the kind of thing that reverberated around the world, and I think made it almost impossible for the British to hold on to Ireland in the face of a population that were clearly determined to secure some form of self-government and independence of some description, which was achieved in 1921. But that's a story for the subsequent sessions of A Farther Shore, which will take place in the next few months. So keep in touch with the embassy and our consulates if you want to get information about our plans for future events under the rubric of A Farther Shore. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Kevin has put in the date and time of the next installment of the series, A Farther Shore. It is on March 25th, coordinated through the University of Notre Dame. And please stay, yes, absolutely stay engaged. I thank you all so very much, the audience, for your engagement and your attention. Your questions are fantastic. My sincere thanks to all three panelists. It really has been a pleasure to work with you. If you have the chance to read through the comments, you are being lauded to the skies for your insights this evening. So I thank you so much. I think that's all, but Kevin has clicked back on. So Kevin?
No, it was just to thank you as well, Mary, for all of your contributions and for shepherding it so wonderfully. It was really a masterful overview. And yeah, the comments are glowing. So if anyone's ego needs a stroke, you should definitely read them. But there's some wonderful stories shared there as well. So thanks to everyone for joining, and we look forward to you joining for the future episodes in the series. Thanks.
Thank you all. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Good night.